So anyone who's facilitated a group will know from their own experience that the atmosphere and the circumstances created by the facilitator really play a huge role in setting up the kind of conversation, the quality of the conversation, and really, in a sense, the standards of presence, really, about how everybody's going to conduct themselves in the group. And I think that's a really important responsibility of the facilitator. So in this video, what we would like to offer is a little collection of 12 things to consider and to think about. And these are things that are worth thinking about, whether you're having a one-on-one conversation.
Absolutely.
But it's particularly in groups, I think, isn't it, Andrew?
For sure.
Yeah. And so before you begin having the conversation with some of Innovative Resources card sets, we warmly invite you to consider these 12 reminders.
It's 12 reminders on how to use cards and create safe spaces for using the cards, isn't it?
That's it.
So I suppose perhaps one of the best things anyone could do would be to have a look at the booklet that's provided with the card set. In there you'll find a lot of information that's drawn from a range of sources. It could be the authors of the cards, or it could be some of the practice wisdom that sits around the cards. And that'll give you some idea, even before you begin, on some of the best ways to think about using the cards, and perhaps the kind of questions that you might ask, and so on. And then there's more, isn't there?
Absolutely. So I think when I think about the booklets, the thing that I keep in mind too is that we don't think of the booklets as a manual. They're not instruction manuals. What we hope to do with the range of activities that are presented in the booklet is to spark the imagination of the person using the cards. And really, the most important thing is that facilitator feels comfortable with the activities they're going to introduce. Please feel free to change the activities, make them work for you as a facilitator and for the group that you're working with. So I think step number 2, apart from reading the booklet,
would be something around knowledge of the cards, wouldn't it?
I think so. I think it's really handy to spread the cards out yourself. Have a look at them. Look at every card. Read what's on them if they've got words. Some of them don't have words; they're just images. But get to know them yourself, so that when the cards are used in the group, there's not a surprise card there. And the other thing that I think is really useful about that, Andrew, I don't know if you do this in your groups, but it's really freeing ourselves up to know that we don't have to use all the cards.
Yeah.
We might want to make a selection. And what can you think of a reason why you might not use all the cards?
Well, the group may be formed for a particular purpose. There may be some reason why everyone's together in the first place. That can be a really good reason. It could be that there's a particular area that you're focused on, that the group has asked you to be focused on anyway. It could be that you've got limited time. You might not have enough time to go through every one of the cards, and you really need to focus the attention on a particular area. And if we're thinking about safe spaces, I think that's another key thing to think about, is that it could be that the group is not at the right time, or it's not a right time for the group really to be thinking about some of those things in the cards. I know that in some workshops that I facilitated, I won't start in at some of the most challenging questions straight away. It's important for you really to set the scene. And that can be reason alone, or reason enough not to use all of the cards at the same time.
That's a really, really good point. And I suppose too, Andrew, thinking about if I practice as a facilitator, if I practice using the cards myself first, maybe I journal using them, maybe I just play with a few activities. It gives me an opportunity to see what my reaction to the cards is. And I guess that's so our second point was knowledge of the cards, and I think the third one is your own reaction to the cards.
Yeah. It's always good to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're working with at any point of time. I think whether that's in general practice or when you're working with people out in the community or when you're using a card set, it has to be done the same way. We have to have some understanding of what it's like to be asked some of those questions, if there are questions involved, or if there's sentence starters, to wonder what it might be like to actually be finishing some of those sentences. Or if it's photo images or any kind of card set, you might have a reason to have a look and think about what it's like for the people that you're working with. It's always important, I think, to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're working with in any situation, and particularly in this one.
And we noticed that too. I know that you and I have often shared in the creation of resources when we're often creating things together, and we ourselves notice that in the actual creating of the content and working with others to create the content, because it's always a very collaborative process. But sometimes things come up for us. I notice that if it's a topic that we might be talking about, something that's quite meaningful or even quite raw, and you don't actually know that it's raw for you until you start delving into that subject and looking at how you would answer some of those questions. So I totally can get what you're saying, because even in the creation of them, it brings up things. So I think that getting to know the cards first and putting yourself in other people's shoes as best you can is incredibly important. And I can imagine too that because so many of our card sets use metaphors and visual metaphors, it might be that some of them are not culturally appropriate. I suppose it could be that some of them just don't make sense. Some of those metaphors
they can be based on an expression. We think about the elephant in the room might be in one culture perfectly understandable, and in another it might be a real mystery. And
that really brings us to the fourth little gem that we wanted to bring forward, and that is the facilitator's knowledge of the people using the cards. Now, of course, a facilitator doesn't necessarily always know the people who are going to be in the group, but a lot of the time the facilitator can take time to have a conversation with the organiser of the workshop, or and find out a little bit about who those participants are. What work area do they work in? What might they have experienced? If the cards are being used, say, for example, in a counselling session, or it might be a peer supervision session, or what are people likely to be experiencing? What do we know about those people? What else is important to know about people, do you think?
Whenever we're using cards with any group, I think it's always good to have some understanding or consideration for who's in the group, and try not to make any assumptions around who's there. It's almost wise to think in terms of going into every group with the assumption that you don't know who might be in there, and make sure that we're creating safe spaces for people who might be from a gender diverse background or a different cultural background to your own. And even to go so far as well as thinking about the literacy levels that are in the group. And for that reason, if there are phrases or words used in the cards, are they going to be understandable to everybody in the group? Or are we watching out for assumptions that we might make around people's different cultural backgrounds? For example, is there someone from an Indigenous background in the group? And what do we need to think about prior to using cards with anybody?
That's incredibly important, I think. And to me, that's that number 4, isn't it? That fourth thing, your knowledge of those using the cards, and really taking that time to think in a very respectful way, and an incredibly inclusive way, about everybody who might be there. And the fifth little gem of a reminder that as a facilitator I think is important is that whole idea of asking ourselves as facilitators, is there any advance notification that we need to give people? So, sometimes, for example, some of our card sets are for talking about things that are really challenging and really go to the very quick of who we are as human beings and how we conduct our relationships. We've got a card set that's designed to have conversations around intimate partner violence, for example. Incredibly important conversations to be having.
But potentially very confronting. And for people to have some idea, maybe it's necessary to give people some advance notice of what might be involved in the workshop that you're facilitating or the group that you're convening to talk about various topics or issues. And it might be worth letting people know a little bit about what they're in for. At the same time as not trying to put people off and make them worry or unnecessarily, but it's another element of creating safe spaces, and why it's the fifth point that we're talking about is that we need to always wonder, what do I need to let people know about what's going to be taking place in a workshop? And especially around cards like this. If we talk about the intimate partner violence for a start, it could be that people have some personal experience of intimate partner violence, and it might be the very best time for them to come and talk about that, or it could be the worst. And making sure that we're not surprising anyone unnecessarily with any of the content around any of the card sets or even any of the content of any workshop.
Yes, and I think when I think about the places and circumstances that the card sets are used, one of those major places is schools, for example. So, you know, wonderful opportunities to have conversations with children, with teens, about relationships, about meaning, about their values, about what's important to them. And we have a whole range of resources that are appropriate to various age groups for having that. But at the same time, as a facilitator, we would be wanting to ask ourselves, what is it that we might want to, that we might have a responsibility to let parents know that this is going to take place in a conversation, that this particular topic is going to be spoken of, and that might be very clear within the within the requirements of the curriculum what some of the social and emotional learning is going to happen. However, we might want to specifically let people know as a facilitator that a particular conversation is going to take place. So, facilitators, that is point number 5 about advance notice and permission that you'd be wanting to think about. And now point number 6 really is looking at the safety of the setting. To me, Andrew, as a facilitator, I think the core of it really is thinking around how people's confidentiality and privacy and dignity are going to be protected, and what can I do as a facilitator. Of course, I can't control everything that happens in the group, and sometimes things are said. However, as a facilitator, the forward planning that I do, the advanced planning I do around thinking about confidentiality, privacy and dignity feels really important.
It's always worth having a discussion anyway with any group, isn't it? We could go ahead and think about some of those things ahead of time and do what we can to do that. It's always a good idea, isn't it, though, to allow the group itself to perhaps have a discussion really openly and transparently about what would constitute a safe and confidential space. Perhaps even go so far as to create some group rules, if that's what's necessary, of course, depending on the situation.
I think that's a really a great idea, because if the group itself collaboratively talks about how do we want to be in this group, how is it that we're going to respect each other in this group, and the group itself asks itself, you know, what enables you to feel safe to share something that might be really important to you, and what would your expectations be, what would your hopes and dreams be for this group if someone were to share something that was really close to their heart or their life. So I think that's a really powerful thing to do, actually, because then you've got, as a facilitator, you've got something that you can bring the group back to if something does go a little awry in the conversation. You can bring them back.
Fits so well, doesn't it, with the strengths approach generally. We often talk about, in strengths practice, this idea of shared responsibility. And in a way, the group is sharing the responsibility for the safety of the group and the respect within the group.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another aspect of it that is important, that supports confidentiality and privacy and respect, is to always allow people and give full permission for people to pass. You know, there's a kind of subtle pressure that you put on yourself as a group participant to participate. You want to be a participator most of the time, and therefore I know I deeply value the facilitator giving me permission not to participate in a particular part of the conversation or in the activity if I don't feel comfortable. So as a facilitator, I really like to make that clear to people right from the start, that they should stay in the driver's seat of what they want to share and not feel pressured in any way by the situation to share something that might put them in a vulnerable place.
And it might be necessary to remind people of that from time to time. I know that there's been times in a workshop where I've made an assumption that everyone's okay with that they know that they have the right to pass and so on. But as I'm sitting there and watching, I see that someone perhaps isn't as comfortable as I had thought that they were. And making that just gentle reminder that people don't have to do everything. That they can participate in the way that suits them the best.
And another technique that I like to use as a facilitator sometimes is to give people to respond to an activity in a fictional way, you know? So really valuing storytelling and that whole narrative approach that, say the question is, what's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? If I'm feeling vulnerable and I actually don't want to share with this group yet, because I don't know them, what the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, I might be free to say, well, I jumped out of a plane with a parachute, and I've never jumped out of a plane with a parachute, but there's fun in the storytelling, and there's also a hidden, subtle way of staying safe by giving people permission to make up a story if they want to.
Or even just wondering about simple things like, does it really need to be fed back to a whole group? You know, is there some way of reorganising things, even on the spot if you have to make something that was going to be a group activity into a simple pairs discussion, for example?
That's a good idea. Or even a journaling, sort of private journaling exercise where people can be writing something that they don't necessarily have to share with the group.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's terrific. And then the other thing that I think is really worth thinking about is if you know that it's going to be a conversation like the one we mentioned before, that it might be about gender diversity or it might be about family violence or something that's really, really quite strong for people. How will people signal to you? Like, it might be that the group decides that it will there'll be a way in which a person can signal when it's gone a little bit far for them, you know, or when they can call a halt and back out of an activity, or just something to let you as the facilitator know that, hey, this is getting a bit too close to the bone, and it could just be that, you know,
Absolutely.
Just a way of indicating.
It's a good little ego check, isn't it, sometimes? You know, you sit there thinking, someone's not participating, it must be something I'm doing wrong. I have to ask them that question again, or I'll need to do something. And it could be just letting things be. Very quietly moving on to the next person and not making it obvious that someone hasn't participated in such a way that they may not be comfortable with.
That feels very respectful. As a facilitator, we don't want to put someone on the spot where they feel exposed, or we need to be thinking about how is that person going to be safe after the group. You know, if this is a group of peers in a school setting, what kind of respect is likely to be already there? You know, is there likely to be sort of comeback afterwards? You know, so to me, I think the safety of the setting is really important. And is there anything else that you do?
Well, I'm just thinking. I'm often thinking about what do I need to do and what do I not need to do. There's times when I've noticed that someone perhaps might have a reaction to any activity. And in some ways we desire that, don't we? We want people to be involved in it. And yet I notice that sometimes it might make someone perhaps feel a little bit, and emotional is not a really great word, but really you can see that there's an effect happening. And wondering whether or not that's an okay thing. Do you really need, if someone chooses to leave the room, for example, do you need to rush off after them? Or do you need to give them their own time and space? I think it's just kind of trying to have that kind of understanding that sometimes what we desire happens, and being ready for that and allowing people to perhaps negotiate that in the way that suits them best.
Yeah.
I think it's a subtle thing, it's a grey area, but always trying to think about, really, do I need to step in? And the art of facilitation is really not doing everything for everybody all the time, and not trying to hand over knowledge all the time, but allowing the group to understand itself and what it's talking about in the way that suits them best, and not really jumping in every time as if you have to.
Yeah. And so it might be that you decide to offer the group, if they want, a designated person who may be there as a person to speak with afterwards to debrief.
Yeah.
That could be a possibility.
As simple as just letting them know that they can come to you and talk to you afterwards.
Yeah.
That's all.
And there are other really simple things too. I think just having, for example, if it's a conversation around intimate partner violence, it might be that you simply have a sheet that you give everybody with some emergency numbers on it. And it's not done with a big fanfare. It just happens to be part of the facilitator's notes that everybody gets, so that nobody's putting themselves in that position of exposing themselves by asking for emergency information or support information. You've just given it as part of the package, so to speak.
And it is part of the package with regard to that particular card, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very much part of it, and it's part of using it is to alert people to that feature.
And so then we come to the planning of the activities, Andrew. What should a facilitator think about when planning the activities?
They should think about reading the book. Because there's a lot of information in the book about the range of activities that you could do. There's probably too many to list here today, but there's a range of ideas in that booklet for how to actually use the cards. It might be group discussions, it could be one-on-one activities, it could be a self-reflective exercise where you're asking yourself some of those questions or doing some thinking on your own, or asking people to do it and feedback and present to a group, for example, would be fine. You probably also need to think about what else you might need. Apart from the card set, it could be, do you need pieces of paper to go with that? Do you need to provide whiteboards or pencils and pens and coloured bits of paper, sticky notes, whatever it might be? What do you need to go along with some of those activities?
Yeah, and I think part of the way in which that relates to the safety of the setting, I think, is to think about having a mix of learning styles, so that you're being inclusive of everybody in the group. There might be, and I think you mentioned that, some quiet ones, some for people who favour a kinesthetic style of learning. They learn so much better if movement can be involved. So introducing activities like shuffling and dealing and moving around the room.
It could be where you place all of the cards on the floor and allow people to wander around and come across them by accident almost.
Yeah.
I've done that quite a lot of times. It works fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's point number 7 really, is looking at the planning of the activities.
7 out of the 12.
7 out of the 12. 7 out of the 12. And the timing and pacing, and you mentioned timing and pacing a little bit before, but I think this is incredibly important because I notice as a facilitator that what I tend to do is include way too much material. And I think it's very important for myself to think about how does that impact on the safety of the setting. If I'm not giving people enough time to share something and it's really close to the bone. I don't know if you've ever been at a workshop where you've had something, you've kind of been waiting for your turn, and it's going to be quite a moment when you get there, and then suddenly there's not quite enough time for you to share. And so I think when it is a really significant and important thing that people are sharing, getting the timing and pacing right is a good thing.
Absolutely. I've only yesterday I was facilitating a workshop where what we were talking about did end up getting a little bit deeper and perhaps further into it than I had anticipated. And even though it was according to my agenda, I wasn't supposed to have a break then, I decided that was the good time to have a break. Because really it's kind of a weight of work, not the time that the work takes. So it's kind of thinking, is it the safest thing to do is probably to have a break now, allow people to gather themselves, and then we can move on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So that's timing and pacing. That's point number 8. And point number 9 is about being inclusive. And again, this is around timing and pacing. But I'm thinking about things like, in any group, we have the more confident voices and we have the quiet voices. And it's making sure that, as well as giving everybody the option to opt out, which we mentioned before, and we'll talk about that a little bit more soon, but it's giving people the opportunity to opt in, that they do have their turn. So making sure that the group sizes and the dynamics of the group work in a particular way, so that people can have their say.
And it fits with the whole reason why we even make resources like these anyway, because they do provide people with new and different ways of being included in ways that otherwise wouldn't have been possible, for sure.
Absolutely. And so that's number 9, being inclusive.
So what's point number 10? Point
number 10 is, again, opting out.
Okay.
So we mentioned that earlier. Being given the option to pass, and participants being aware that they can leave.
Yep.
It's not a locked door. No one's forced to have the conversation. So I think that opting out has got to be a primary safety measure. And of course, at the same time, as facilitators, we're really encouraging people to participate as well. So
Always.
It's a bit of a balance.
Yeah.
So we come to point number 11, or tip number 11, Andrew.
Yeah.
Plan B.
Plan B. Always wise to have a plan B. We can go in as facilitators with the best laid plans sometimes. We can go in with a pretty good idea of how we want things to go. And maybe we've done it before. Maybe we've done this workshop several times and we've got a pretty good idea of what can happen. And even then we can be surprised by what takes place. And in a way it can be as a result of someone getting further into a discussion than we had anticipated, or perhaps someone in the group feeling that it triggered something that we hadn't planned. We can't know some of those things, even though we might have experienced it several times. So having some other way. It could be that we need to drop the activity altogether.
Yeah.
It could mean that we need to stop and think. It could mean that we need to plan to have something else ready to go.
Yeah.
Whatever we can think of that we are ready to do at the moment's notice. I suppose you lessen the chances of when you really need that plan B if you do some of that preparation that we talked about earlier.
That's right, isn't it? It's about setting up the conditions where, when the conversation does take place, there's been a certain level of trust that's been established within the group, and that the group trusts you as the facilitator. And
it goes to, again, this thing we've been talking about sometimes, parallel practice. How do we do what we do within these workshops that would be reiterated outside in the work that we might do in the community? So if we're talking about being safe in the community and allowing people choice and options and the right to pass and the work that we do with them and some kind of agency in the change that they're willing or hoping to make, then we can do the same thing in a workshop where we use some of these resources. So it's really mirroring practice in the workshop itself.
Fantastic, love that. So now,
number 12.
Number 12, the last point.
That's right.
So this is really about follow-up, and I think this point links to, some of the other points that we've made along the line about having signs of a person being able to indicate that they want to opt out, or that they're feeling a certain way, or supporting them with someone who may need to debrief. So it's thinking about, and there isn't always a need for follow-up, but it's asking ourselves the question as facilitators, is there any follow-up that's needed? Do we want to set up a situation where we're touching base with each of the participants afterwards? It could be via email, with their permission, of course. Is it something that we might want to follow up with another session, further down the track? And also following up can be really useful, because that's when we can often hear feedback about how the person felt with the activities that we as the facilitator introduced, and I know it helps my learning to find out what it was like to be that participant. So feedback can be useful.
And it can be great, can't it? I mean, you end up finding out things that affirm what you did. you can find out that you are on the right track, that things are going well. Feedback and follow-up can be some of the most affirming, helpful sort of material that we get in any workshop. It's not always what happens during, but after the workshop can be some of the most memorable and helpful things, can't it?
And the last thing I would say about following up too is it seems to work well to agree with the group at the beginning if there's going to be follow-up. You know, it might be something like, I'd like to check in with each of you after this conversation, is that okay? And then in that way, nobody feels that they're being singled out for follow-up because, you know, that they were particularly vulnerable or anything like that. It feels like a safe way to engage people in follow-up.
It goes both ways. I mean, often at the start of every workshop, I ask people or let people know that they can get in touch with me.
Yeah.
And that I'd be very happy to hear from anybody with any feedback about the workshop, if there's something that they've thought about later that they thought could be different, or just get in touch with me with new ideas about what else we could be doing. That's always okay. Simple as handing out contact details and email addresses and phone numbers and texting, emails, fine, whatever can be done.
That's great. I like that. So Andrew, we're coming to a close, and I'm thinking about the fact that despite everything that we might do as a facilitator, and there is so much that we can do, we can't guarantee, you know, that there's always a risk in a conversation, you know, in a deep conversation, in a conversation that asks people or invites people to give their thoughts about, you know, all kinds of things that, and comments can be made by people that really touch on vulnerabilities that other people in the room may have. And we as a facilitator, we can't control that. And in the same way that all of the resources that we create, all of the card sets come out of Strengths Approach to Practice, where, you know, we want them to be used in that respectful and inclusive way. However, nothing guarantees they will be. Just because they come out of Strengths Approach to Practice doesn't mean to say that they will be used in that way.
Absolutely.
And so I suppose I'm wanting to finish with asking you, what do you think about that? You know, what do you think about the risks involved and how we mitigate them?
I think going into any workshop without some, I'm not saying expectation of something happening, but acceptance of something happening is a good way to go. I suppose one of the joys of these workshops is that the unexpected can happen, and we can anticipate that and even relish that when it happens. But even still, it can happen to the point when someone may say something or do something that is or felt to be disrespectful by someone in the room, even if it comes out of best intentions. So there's a range of things I think that you can do within any workshop, which, as you say, are mitigated a lot by your preparation, a lot by your creating group rules and so forth. And especially, as we've been saying, you know, the idea that a group takes responsibility for the running of the workshop, and that's laid out at the start of a workshop. And even still, you can get to that point in the day when someone may say or do something that is felt to be disrespectful. I suppose there's a range of things we can do. We can do a lot of active listening to people and allowing people to say what they need to say without automatically reacting to it or trying to naysay it. Allowing it to be said and then moving on. It could be where you ask for other opinions about the same topic, so you're automatically increasing the diversity of views and allowing that to happen. And what else do you think that you could do in a workshop?
I think it's remarkable the extent to which the atmosphere of a workshop or a conversation is established by the way the facilitator holds themselves. You spoke about active listening. There's something quite powerful. I mean, there's a powerful role to be a facilitator. Even as we are facilitating, we're not. There's not a hierarchy there. it is a place of power, and I think the best possible use of that power by the facilitator is to create by their own example the way in which we listen, the way in which comments are received, the way in which we ask people for different points of view, the way in which we facilitate that conversation at the beginning around the group rules or the group standards. And they can include things such as not over-talking somebody. And we can even have a conversation at the beginning about not labelling and what that means. What do we understand that means? And we can even invite the group to be really open and to think about things in ways that they maybe haven't thought of before. And if you were being your absolute best respectful self, what would that feel like, and what would you be doing?